Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Well, it's the end of the year, and that means another Outlook series. We are starting the 2024 Outlook series next week, and I thought it would be a great way to kick it off with sitting down with Craig Jeffery, our managing partner here at Strategic Treasurer, discussing the past year and kind of giving us an intro for this series. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Good to see you, John.
All right, so let's start off with doing a recap of a couple different things we've seen this past year, not just talking about AI and the hot topics, but talking about a couple other things.
But I want to talk about AI and some of the other topics.
Okay, you can talk about it a little bit, but maybe only in the technology piece.
Okay.
Can you start off by talking about some of the market changes and changes to overall Treasury that we've seen the past year?
Well, there's certainly, a fair bit of global conflict happening. That's had an impact on Treasury, the supply chain. Inflation has moderated down a bit, but the rate of inflation and then the rates that are put out by the central banks are having an impact. It's brought us out of this outlook where we might go into recession in Europe and in North America to I call it maybe a mild recovery or mild positive factor. So it's eased up a little bit. So the economy has shifted through the year, I would say, from a little more chop to a little less chop, certainly not smooth sailing. The capital is a lot harder to get by, particularly for medium-sized organizations and certainly smaller firms. The overall impact of things like some of the bank defaults that have happened has really had a significant impact on how people are looking at counterparty risk. Or it's certainly raised the attention of counterparty risk. There's been some action on it, but a minimal amount for what should be. So some of those economic things have impacted us in those ways. Bank defaults, rate changes, access to capital, and then some supply chain activities.
What do you think the industry's learned from these bank defaults? Like, how are people thinking differently now versus a year ago?
There's a certain percentage that are thinking differently. Even finance and risk management professionals too quickly go back to, hey, there's no noise today. There's no emergency. There's no fire to put out today. The good part of it is that certain organizations are saying, yes, we need to look at counterparty risk. The level of defaults may vary year to year, but some of the discipline needs to be put in place. And maybe we need to be more vigilant and more formal during times that have a little bit more turbulence. But we still need to have some formality around that. And that's where the good news is some people are making changes. The bad news is a significant number don't. That's risky for being in a risk management area where you're designed to act as the risk manager, protector of the most liquid assets. So there's quite a few people who need to step up their game there.
I mean, I do this. I don't take it seriously until it happens to me. You might hear about something that happened to your neighbor, but it hits different when it hits you. So, all right, let's move on into technology. So you wanted to talk about AI a little bit. What, other than AI, what new tech have we seen this year?
Well, maybe it's not just new tech, but some of the tech that's ramping up and amping up. There's not always a year of something. There's years where things start to get introduced and then they slowly scale. I think one of the bigger stories here on the tech is more small and medium businesses are using larger company treasury tech, payment hubs, treasury management systems, treasury aggregators. This is happening. The tech is becoming more affordable. It's easier to use. The value is greater. The cost is lower. And so this is creating the democratization of some of this tech use. I think that's really helpful because it's coming downstream and downscale quite rapidly. That's probably one of the most significant things generally on that topic. But you did ask, how did it impact Treasury to get their job done? There's at least as much of an impact on the changing age cohorts that are coming through, driving people to use more tech. The newer age category, the Zoomers, don't want to do dumb things, manual processes. They don't want to do it because they can get jobs where they don't have to do manual processes. That's driving some better behavior in terms of tech acquisition. I'm pretty positive about that. That's one of the best things that the Zoomers are doing is pushing for more tech and not settling for very inefficient processes. So those are a couple of things. APIs are continuing to be used where they can. If a vendor has connectivity with their banks via APIs, more of their customers are using those. Those are helpful, but it's still it's a long road to have that rollout throughout the whole industry for all the activity that a company may need to do.
And the adoption's mostly driven by cost coming down?
I mean, ultimately that will drive it down, but the reason people are doing it is where it can be set up, it can be set up more quickly, especially using the newer tech. If it's already established, it's turning it on, it works right away. Just like your smartphone and the apps that you have, the APIs work behind the scenes and you enjoy the features. To the extent that when banks and fintechs connect and make that easier, now all of a sudden you're using and consuming data. You're executing and improving transactions more rapidly. And I think that's the ease of setup is what's driving it more readily. I think there's going to be cost elements to that. There's going to be speed elements to that in the future, but those will be contributors to the decision. They're not the only driver, except in some use cases.
Okay. So we've seen it help a lot with efficiency and time wasting. You're getting rid of all these manual processes that you're wasting time on. Is it helping with other things like strategic thinking and fraud prevention, or is that just giving you more time to understand those things?
Well, it's because it's freeing up time and allowing people to focus. It's helping in those regards, particularly the APIs, and some of the other tech that's available. On the fraud side, a significant number of companies are using that through their vendors' use of AI and machine learning, pattern detection to detect fraud. That's having an impact, and it's real. This is the year that became real. There was people playing with it the last few years. It's making a mark, and that's only going to grow. So that's a real check plus for this year. On the efficiency front, avoiding doing jobs that robots or automation should do. That's this not never ending, but a long time shift and trend that Treasury needs to continue to eliminate those activities because they have so much analysis and risk management and KYC and regulation and control and access to capital that they need to be focusing on, that part of their resources are being aligned and absorbed by the black hole that are manual processes. And it's taking that time. It's creating a problem. And so automating that helps relieve that, which frees up time for better activities. Now, do people always use that to do better activities? Some people use that, hey, now I have a little bit of free time where I can do other low value activities. Anybody who wants to proceed and advance in their career will use that for more analysis, doing better functions, more value added tasks for their organization. And in Treasury, there's usually massive amounts of value that they can add if they could spend more time. And so this is making a difference for those people and groups that are using that freed up time for better, higher value functions.
Do you have any tips for people that are not quick to change and see new processes? Because that kind of person might struggle with everything changing quickly, and it will continue to change quickly. Any tips for jumping forward and seeing these new things coming? What do you spend your time on after you have more free time?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if anybody's watched, people who are listening, if they've watched the Terminator movie, and there's always this, like the robots are out to hunt people and Sarah Connor and all that. The idea that you're being chased. Now, if you're doing functions that are much more readily done by automation, one of your first jobs should be to automate those tasks, get rid of those tasks, and have the machines do it. Have the programs, the macros, the bots that you build and that your team builds, do that, automate those. You have to continue to make your organization more efficient over time and scale because your organization is acquiring companies. They're tasked with more risk management functions, more visibility functions. They need to do more analysis. How do you find that time? You have to become more efficient. So from a efficiency standpoint, that's a key driver, driving out cost for how much time and how much cost it takes to do something. That's always important. But what's even more important is freeing up time for those better tasks, higher value tasks. So to your question is what should people do? You should always be trying to make the functions you do obsolete. If you can eliminate them, eliminate them. If they can be automated, automate them. That has to be a mindset. It's not, if I do these 5 things, I've arrived. It's how do I continue to do that to add value to the organization? And that becomes, in some senses, fixing the task, but also managing and thinking about what is the data we have? How are we going to be able to use that in the future, even if we can't use it today? How will that help me do better analysis next year, the year after?
Yeah, that's not the most common mindset for people to have.
No, a day is busy. You come in, you blink, the day's over. Then it's Thursday, then it's Friday, and people are heading out. And then you're waiting until the next week. But this idea of how do I make sure I am doing a better job next week, next month, and next quarter, substantially better job over the next quarter, that requires individual steps and a relentless focus on it. And that isn't so common.
So if you're doing the same thing you were doing 12 months ago, the robots are coming for your job.
Well, the robots are coming for your job, and you're not being as good of a steward in most cases. I mean, there's certain situations where you have to do those things. There's no resources you can have, and it takes the full day. But your group should be making sure the whole group is getting more efficient and more effective at what they do. If not, it's a failure of stewardship of people's time and the use of tech to support that.
Gotcha. So if the listeners have any disagreements or ideas to send our way, send it to podcast@strategictreasurer.com. Let's move on into compliance and risk management. What do we see this year in that front?
If you ask me over the last 10 years, every year or most years seemed like, hey, there's quite a bit of regulations or compliance activities that are coming on this next year. It's busy. It's busier. It tends to increase. I would say this particular year was more of a light to moderate year as I look back over the last couple of decades. Now, I'm not saying that's going to continue, but it was a little bit lighter. Certainly, there were some things. The beneficial ownership interest in the U.S., the BOI, as we call it, those requirements were coming. They've pushed them out just a little bit, but that's all part of the KYC, bank account management, control regimen that organizations need to have. Most are woefully unaware of it. Oh, that's not something we have to be concerned about. I don't know, therefore I don't have to be concerned about it. You do. There's a little bit more time to be ready for it. But maybe in the show notes we can drop in some information on that report. We just updated it when a new change came out for BOI. On the investment side, certainly some institutional money market funds, some of the fund regulations are rolling out. Some changes are coming through. Those are definitely worth reading about. We have some podcasts with Federated Hermes, some webinars. There's quite a bit of content about that treasury organizations need to stay current on.
So moving on to strategies with all the changes in rates, with economic uncertainty at the start of this past year, did that change anybody's strategy within Treasury? Did it steer them differently than they were going in 2022?
Certainly from a rate perspective, organizations were earning almost nothing. And then in a very short order, around a year type time frame, rates have moved up in the U.S. to, over 5.25% short-term rates from the Fed. This certainly caused people to pay a little more attention to, balances left in bank accounts, what investments they're making. So, as they moved off the floor, people got busier. I mean, ECR was no longer nothing. A lot of organizations are paying attention to how banks are compensating them for balances. The revitalization of sweep accounts at banks came back in with power this year. So certainly there's a number of investment vehicles, different types of instruments that are being used, weren't done as heavily, a year ago. You talked about strategies. So there's some strategies on due to interest rate changes and what's occurring there. There's also a couple other things when you said strategies I thought about were counterparty risk, managing counterparties, particularly banks. From that perspective, there's a number of banks failed. There's concern. How do you calibrate the risks that they have? How do you prioritize which banks require a little more watching carefully? Do you have a counterparty risk dashboard that you're tracking? Is that really informal? It's in your head, or is that something you're pulling in multiple points of data? A number of organizations started doing more on that, became a little more formal this year, but that's an area that's not been as formal as I think it should be. based on what's happened and where institutions are today. It's not general panic, but there's certainly warning signs. Heed those warning signs. The other thing that came up on the risk side, because you mentioned risk, I would say on the payment security side, the risk on payments, the types of fraud that have occurred, there's a number of pretty complex frauds that have happened that have caught a number of organizations and nonprofits unawares, unprepared. And while there's a long time focus on, do we have our firewalls up? I think we also have to make sure we're putting the right structures in place with our banks and the right fraud prevention tools and services with our banks. We use and leverage what the technology providers have, and certainly look at the right type of making sure people are updated. So payment security training, assess your payment processes, train your people, put the right structures in place, use the services that the banks offer. Those are a number of risks that a number of people got more serious about. We expect to see that continue in the early part of 2024.
Very true. We also covered a lot this past year on financial fraud with our Learning from Financial Fraud series. We covered quite a few different things that have happened in the past, as well as things that have happened this year. If you want to listen more into those, you can find the link to the 7-episode series in the show notes. Craig, what would be your big takeaway from this recap?
Yeah, what are the takeaways? If we think about AI, staffing, and warnings, all of those together, what would I say at the end of the show? I would say the warning signs and close calls that we had if you had them with fraud, if you had them with counterparties or your banks running into a problem, those are an opportunity to get your stuff in order, to get your organization organized around that. It's not another opportunity to forget and let things pass into time and say, hey, no one could have predicted that. We don't need to do it. We'll just talk about it for a while and we'll let it slide until the next time. And then we'll say the same thing. No one could have predicted that. And it could have happened. When you have the ability to, in a calibrated way, not spend everything that exists to address a problem, but it doesn't take much to put yourself in a significantly better position to handle the risks that are coming up. So use the warning signs and close calls as an opportunity to put yourself in a stronger footing.
Thanks for sharing your insights. I'm excited to get into this 2024 Outlook series. We've got our first episode recorded and ready to come out next week. And we've got a number of interesting topics and insights for the year ahead.
Sounds good. Thanks, John.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.